People like you don't belong here. Take your daughter and go.
Did I want to go back inside?
The night my husband threw me out, he had 40 investors inside and a girlfriend wearing my dress. Travis grabbed my suitcase and dropped it down the front steps of Breakwater House himself, not a staff member, not a gesture delegated to someone else. Him. Then he looked at my father, who had just stepped out of an old pickup truck in a worn jacket, and said loud enough for the foyer to hear, "People like you don't belong here. Take your daughter and go." My father didn't answer him. He walked to me, picked up the suitcase, and asked me one quiet question. Did I want to go back inside? I said no. What Travis never once considered was that the man he'd just humiliated controlled every dollar he owed, and I was the only one who would inherit the decision of what to do with it. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing. This channel is built for people who believe that dignity doesn't require an explanation. Now let's get into the story. My father picked up the suitcase without looking at Travis, without looking at the guests hovering near the glass doors, without acknowledging any of it. And he walked to his truck the same way he walked everywhere, like a man who had already decided what mattered and wasn't interested in revising the list. I followed him. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. There was no one inside that house I wanted to say goodbye to, not anymore. And the realization of that, how completely and suddenly it was true, settled over me before we had even reached the end of the gravel drive. Travis's voice carried behind us something smooth and redirecting, already converting what had just happened into an anecdote for his guests. I didn't turn around. My father pulled onto the road and drove, and I watched the trees close in on both sides until Breakwater House was just a light source somewhere behind the branches. He didn't ask me to explain. He never did. That was one of the things about my father that I had taken for granted for most of my life. His ability to sit with a situation without demanding that it be processed out loud on his schedule. We drove for 20 minutes in complete quiet, and it wasn't the kind of quiet that needs to be filled. It was the kind that means someone is with you. I had grown up near Camden with a father who fixed his own gutters and drove a pickup older than my college degree, and spent his evenings in a workshop behind the house doing work he rarely described in detail. Most people who met Warren Ellsworth assumed the workshop was where he built things with his hands, furniture maybe, or cabinetry. It wasn't. It was where he thought. He needed somewhere to put his hands while his mind worked through decisions that would have been incomprehensible to almost anyone in Camden, Maine. By the time I was in my early 20s, I understood who he actually was. Warren Ellsworth, the W.E., that circulated in certain financial conversations the way a rumor circulates, attributed, but never sourced, known without being fully seen. He had spent 30 years building Alderon Global Consortium into something that controlled stakes across energy shipping, telecommunications, mining, and infrastructure in more than 40 countries. The total assets under management had passed $1.2 trillion before I finished graduate school. He drove a 1998 pickup truck and had never permitted a verified photograph of himself to appear in any publication. He preferred it that way. What he wanted for me was a life that couldn't be reduced to that number. He wanted me to have relationships, real ones chosen freely, without the distorting weight of what I stood to inherit. I agreed with him. I used my own salary from my own work, rented a small apartment I could afford on my own, and kept every connection to my father's world behind a door I chose not to open. I wanted to know whether someone could love me when I came without any of it. I thought Travis Barrett was the answer to that question. I met him through a coastal redevelopment project outside Camden, where I was coordinating community outreach, and he was presenting a waterfront mixed-use proposal to the city planning committee. He was compelling in the way that certain people are compelling not because they're performing, but because they genuinely believe in the version of reality they're describing, and that belief is contagious. He talked about building things that would last, about doing the work himself with his own name on it. We spent nearly 2 years getting to know each other before we married, and in those 2 years I had no real reason to doubt him. In the early years of the marriage, I poured everything available to me into Barrett Coastal Ventures. My savings weren't substantial, but they went in. My time was less finite, and it went in without limit. Late nights rewriting project plans, weekends building presentation decks. Introductions to community organizations that gave Travis's proposals a credibility they wouldn't have had on their own. I did none of it for compensation, because I believed we were building something that belonged to both of us. During that same period, Travis had made public commitments to sponsor several local nonprofits, partly for goodwill, and partly because it gave him access to planning committees that were useful to the business. The paperwork moved through the office regularly, grant co-signatures, support letters, funding applications, and I came in on weekends to sign where my signature was needed. I trusted the documents were what they appeared to be. Kendra Hale was the one who managed the filing system. She had been with the company almost from the start, running investor relations, and she had full access to every folder in that office, both physical and digital. I signed what was put in front of me and thought nothing more about it. There was one other thing I noticed during that period, something small I hadn't known what to make of at the time. The notary seal, the personal stamp we kept in the filing cabinet in our home office for signing official documents, went missing sometime during the 2nd year of the marriage. I looked for it twice and then assumed it had been misplaced the way ordinary things get misplaced in a busy household. I didn't ask Travis about it directly. I had already begun by then to choose carefully which questions were worth the friction they would cause. The company grew, and Travis became someone slightly different than the man I had married, not all at once, but in increments that were each individually explainable until you stepped back and looked at the whole shape of the change. He became conscious of restaurants in a way he hadn't been before, of who was seen at which table and with whom. He started noticing my car, the age of it, the way I dressed for events, the fact that I didn't have family connections that opened doors he wanted opened. His mother, Pamela, had always made her feelings clear. She had disliked me before she knew me, the way certain people decide in advance that someone isn't worth the effort. She told Travis sometimes within my hearing that he had married the wrong woman, that I brought nothing useful to the life he was building, that a man with his trajectory deserved someone who could help him get somewhere. Travis didn't argue with her. That was the part that took time to admit to myself, not that Pamela said those things, but that Travis never once pushed back. And then gradually he stopped needing her to say them, because he had begun to believe them himself. I noticed things I tried not to make too much of. Phone calls taken in other rooms. Receipts that materialized briefly and then disappeared. A particular quality of distance in conversations that had never been distant before. When I said anything, Travis told me I was insecure, that my upbringing had made me read suspicion into ordinary professional relationships, that I didn't understand the demands of the world he was operating in. He said it with patience, which made it harder to argue with than if he had said it with anger. I started measuring my own instincts against his explanations and finding my instincts wanting. That is a specific kind of damage, the kind where someone teaches you that your own perception is the unreliable part. What I didn't know while I was doing that was that Barrett Coastal Ventures was in serious trouble. Travis had borrowed heavily to develop Breakwater Point, a luxury coastal resort that had become the centerpiece of everything he was building his reputation around. The revenue projections in the loan documents bore no real relationship to the company's actual financial performance. He had committed to developing on coastal wetland that required environmental permits he hadn't secured. Several investors listed as committed in the loan paperwork had quietly withdrawn months earlier, and none of that had been disclosed to the lenders. The gap between what the project owed and what it had was widening. And if Travis didn't raise $80 million in new investment, within 7 days, Breakwater Point would default and take the company down with it. He arranged the event at Breakwater House, a rented property on the development site, and spent money the company didn't have to make the space look like it belonged to a company that had everything. Kendra organized the evening. I was told to stay in the back and out of sight. The event was scheduled on the anniversary of my mother's death. My father called that morning to say he was making the drive up from Portland and wanted to visit the cemetery together, which was what we did every year on that date. I let him know I was at Breakwater House and would come out to meet him as soon as the evening wound down. Travis saw the message and his expression shifted not into anger right away, but into the kind of controlled calculation that preceded anger when he was managing an audience. He told me to call my father and send him home. I told him my father was picking me up, not attending the party. Travis said it didn't matter how it looked from the outside. I told him I wasn't making the call. An hour later, gravel crunched under tires in the drive. My father got out wearing his dark jacket, the one with the fraying cuffs he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years, carrying the small wooden box that had belonged to my mother, the one he always brought to the cemetery. Pamela was near the entrance and said something to Kendra when she saw him coming up the walk. I was close enough to hear the shape of it. Something about people who appear at events like this with their hands out. Kendra's expression confirmed the rest. Travis crossed the foyer and told my father in a voice measured for an audience to leave the property. My father looked at him without any particular expression, not surprise, not offense, just a kind of steady observation. I stepped between them and told Travis that this was my father and that he had no right to speak to him that way. Travis looked at me the way he had been looking at me for months past me, really. The way you look past something you've already categorized and set aside, and then turned to face the room. He announced to the guests, drifting toward the foyer, that our marriage was finished. That I had never contributed anything meaningful to what he had built. That I didn't belong in that house. Kendra moved to his side, her hand finding his arm with the ease of something practiced. Pamela summoned a member of the catering staff and instructed him to bring my bag down from upstairs. It arrived and was set on the front steps. Travis removed his wedding ring and dropped it into the bag's outer pocket with the gesture of someone returning something they had borrowed and were glad to be done with. "Take your father and go," he said. "I won't let the two of you drag me back to having nothing." My father came to where I was standing. He picked up the suitcase. He looked at me and asked without any urgency or pressure in his voice whether I wanted to go back inside. I looked at Travis, at Kendra, at Pamela, with her arms folded and her chin at that particular angle she used when she was satisfied with how something had gone. None of them looked uncertain. None of them looked like people waiting to find out they were wrong. I said no. I said there was nothing left inside that I needed. We drove to the cemetery first, because that was where we had been going all along. My father set the wooden box on the ground near my mother's grave and told me she had left something inside it for me. A letter and a few other things prepared before she died, held by him until the moment felt right. Inside was a letter in her handwriting, a small key and a wax seal impressed with the Alderon emblem, the mark I had known since childhood, as the private symbol of my father's other life. In the letter my mother wrote that she hoped I would never need to use power to prove I was worth loving. But if the day came when someone converted my kindness into a tool for diminishing me, I had to understand that walking away was not defeat. The real failure, she wrote, was allowing the people who had hurt me to keep authoring my identity. Afterward, my father drove to Redfern Estate, the family property outside Camden, behind a section of private woodland I hadn't passed through in years. The gate opened when we arrived, and that felt different than it had before, weighted in a way I hadn't expected. Julian Cross was waiting inside. He had been my father's lead attorney for as long as I could remember, the kind of presence that existed at the edge of every significant moment in our family, without ever drawing attention to itself. He told me that my father had initiated the formal process of transferring voting rights at Alderon Global Consortium to my name several months earlier, and that an initial block of those rights had already been transferred on an interim basis, with the remainder pending final board ratification. I was not only Warren Ellsworth's daughter. I was the sole heir to the entire Alderon structure, every trust, every holding, every position my father had built and maintained across 3 decades. My father laid out 2 paths. I could keep my identity private, accept a financial settlement that would give me independence, and let him manage the situation with Travis from a distance. Or I could step into the role that had been prepared for me, learn to run Alderon directly, and make my own decisions about what accountability looked like for the people who had chosen to treat me as expendable. I didn't want my father handling this on my behalf. That felt like handing Travis the final word, letting him define my response as something that required rescue rather than action. But I also understood that if I stayed invisible, Travis would walk away from what he had done with the company I had helped build and carry those habits somewhere else. I looked at the Alderon seal on the table. I thought about the ring dropped into a suitcase pocket. I thought about Kendra's hand on Travis's arm, and Pamela's satisfied expression, and the 40 guests who had watched all of it and done nothing. I told my father I didn't want Travis destroyed. I said I wanted to see completely clearly and on the record the full extent of what he had actually done. My father nodded once. Julian opened a folder, and I walked through a door that had always been waiting for me to decide I was ready. The Alderon executive offices in Portland occupied 3 floors of a building with no exterior signage and no visible reception desk from the street. My father had designed it that way on purpose. People who needed to find Alderon already knew where it was. Everyone else didn't need to know it existed. I arrived on a Monday morning with a folder Julian had prepared and sat down at a conference table with 6 people who had been running this organization longer than I had fully understood what it was. They were professionally courteous. They were also skeptical in the particular way of people who have watched institutions survive by being careful about who they trust. One of them, a man named Gerald, 22 years, with Alderon, directed a question at my father about whether it was wise to accelerate the transition given the current circumstances. My father told him I was in the room, and that if he had concerns about my readiness, he should raise them with me directly. Gerald turned and repeated the question. I told him I hadn't come to debate my presence. I asked him to give me the Breakwater Point file in 3 days. The file was significantly worse than what Travis had ever let on. The revenue projections submitted to Alderon's lending subsidiary to secure the original loan had been inflated well beyond anything the company's actual quarterly performance could support. The development footprint included a section of protected coastal wetland requiring a full state environmental review before construction could legally proceed, a review that had been initiated and then quietly allowed to stall when the timeline became inconvenient for Travis's draw schedule. Multiple investors listed as committed in the loan documentation had in fact withdrawn their commitments months before the latest disbursement was approved, and none of that had been disclosed. What Travis had borrowed was real money. What he had said to borrow it was not. Then I found my name on a document I had never signed, a financial guarantee dated 14 months earlier, for $25 million with Maren Ellsworth Barrett listed as co-obligor on the primary loan. I looked at the signature for a long time. It had the right proportions, the right spacing between letters. It was built from the way I actually write my name, not a rough approximation of it. But I had never seen that document. I had never agreed to personally backstop anything connected to Breakwater Point. I sat with that page and worked backward through everything I could remember, and the answer came together slowly, but without any real uncertainty once it started forming. During the early years of the marriage, I had come into the office on weekends to sign nonprofit paperwork, grant co-signatures, community funding applications, letters of organizational support. Those documents were filed and managed by Kendra. She had full access to every physical and digital folder in that office. A high-resolution scan of my signature existed somewhere in those files on paper I had signed in good faith for purposes that had nothing to do with a $25 million loan guarantee. And the notary seal, the one that had disappeared from our home office filing cabinet during the second year of our marriage, the one I had written off as misplaced, would have been exactly what was needed to make a forged document appear properly authenticated. Someone had known where to find both. If I could prove the guarantee was forged, Travis faced criminal liability. If I couldn't prove it before the situation became public, I could be treated as a co-obligor on a fraudulent debt I had never knowingly incurred. Julian told me to document everything and make no public statements until we had built the case properly. He also told me that Alderaan would immediately suspend all further disbursements to Breakwater Point, which meant the window Travis had been racing against the 7-day deadline to raise $80 million had effectively ceased to exist. There was no path to new investment, while the primary lender had frozen the account. The project wasn't going to be rescued by an 11th-hour commitment from a new backer. It was going to survive or collapse entirely on what the next few weeks uncovered. Travis still believed during all of this that I was somewhere in Camden with my father and running low on options. A divorce settlement arrived through his attorney offering a lump sum that didn't reflect even a fraction of what I had put into the company contingent on my signing away any claim to Barrett Coastal Ventures or its assets. A note from his attorney suggested that if I responded promptly, Travis would agree to let me keep the car. I did not respond. The notification from Alderaan reached Barrett Coastal Ventures shortly after all loan disbursements suspended pending financial review, and the company's principals were required to appear at an investor evaluation session at Pineglass Forum in Portland. Travis interpreted this as the opportunity he had been hoping for, a room full of people he could address directly, a chance to reframe the situation on his own terms before it was framed for him. He had no idea who had requested the session or who would be running it. He began preparing a presentation built around himself as the sole architect of Barrett Coastal Ventures, the version of the company's history from which my name had been removed entirely. I arrived at Pineglass Forum early and took a seat at the back of the room. Travis came in beside him and Pamela, a step behind the three of them, moving with the composed confidence of people who believed the setting was working in their favor. He scanned the room without registering me. He was focused on the stage. My father walked out first. I watched Travis process what he was seeing in real time. The recognition, the confusion, the attempt to hold his expression neutral while something underneath it recalibrated. Julian Cross approached the microphone and introduced Warren Ellsworth as the founder and controlling principal of Alderaan Global Consortium, currently managing assets in excess of $1.2 trillion. The room rose. Travis remained seated. He sat without moving while the sentence finished arranging itself into something he could no longer reinterpret, that the man in the worn jacket, the man he had ordered off the Breakwater House property, had personally structured the loan that was the only thing standing between Travis's company and complete financial collapse. Then Julian announced that Warren Ellsworth was transferring his executive chairmanship to his sole heir. I walked onto the stage. My full name appeared on the screen behind me. Warren Ellsworth Barrett, sole heir and incoming executive chair, and I let it stay there for a moment before I looked at the room and then at Travis. I didn't look at him with anger. I had thought about this moment enough to know that anger wasn't what I wanted to bring into it. I opened the Breakwater Point file and asked Travis to explain the gap between the revenue figures submitted to Alderon's lending division and the company's verified quarterly performance. I asked him about the environmental review that had been filed and abandoned. I asked him about the financial guarantee bearing my signature on a document I had never seen before. I found it in his loan file. Travis said this was a private family matter, and that I was using my father's institution to retaliate against a husband I was angry at. His voice stayed level, but his hands were pressed flat on his knees, and Kendra 2 rows back had gone very still in the way of someone recalculating what story it was still safe to be part of. I announced that Alderon was freezing all disbursements pending a full forensic audit. Barrett Coastal Ventures became functionally insolvent before the room had finished clearing. What followed Travis constructed entirely on his own. Within 2 days, he was speaking to cameras with a fully developed counter-narrative, a small business founder targeted by a wealthy wife who had concealed her family's resources throughout their marriage and was now deploying a $1 trillion organization to settle a personal grievance. Pamela appeared in a local news interview and described her family as the victims of a calculated deception. Travis released the forged guarantee to the press and stated publicly that I had been fully aware of Breakwater Point's financial difficulties all along and had only claimed ignorance once the project began to fail. The coverage divided quickly, some reading the story as a powerful woman weaponizing inherited wealth, others reading it as exactly what it was, but the division was enough to create real pressure. What mattered was what was in the files, not what was on the screen. The Alderon board responded to the coverage by asking my father to pause the completion of the formal voting rights ratification until my connection to the loan could be independently verified. The interim rights already transferred remained in place, but the full consolidation was on hold. Travis filed a court motion to restrict my access to marital assets, largely a tactical move since the Alderon trust structures predated our marriage by nearly a decade and were well outside any marital property framework, but effective at extending the news cycle and sustaining the impression of a contested situation. Julian sat across from me and said what I already knew, that a public emotional response would confirm Travis's version of events to anyone who hadn't been paying close attention. The path forward was documentary, not personal, evidence sequence and documented fact. Not the image of my suitcase on those steps, not what I had watched happen in that foyer. Then Travis submitted his final set of materials to the board. He provided a series of emails appearing to show me discussing the terms of the Breakwater Point guarantee before the document had been dated, suggesting I had known about the arrangement all along. He also submitted an audio recording in which my voice, cut from something longer stripped of its opening, seemed to say that I could use my father's company to make Travis lose everything. The emails had structural inconsistencies that a server-level analysis would identify, but that analysis required time the board wasn't prepared to wait for. The recording was missing the 12 words that preceded the fragment Travis had kept. Without the full sentence, the meaning was unrecognizable from the original. The board had neither the server data nor the complete audio yet, and what they had was enough to act on. They suspended my interim voting rights pending an independent investigation. My father attempted to address the board directly that same afternoon. He stood at the head of the table and had begun laying out the sequence of events, the loan structure, what Julian's team had already found, when he stopped in the middle of a sentence and reached behind him for the back of a chair. One of the board members was on his feet immediately. My father was taken from the room on a stretcher. 2 hours later, he was in surgery for a severe cardiac arrhythmia that had apparently been developing for months without symptoms anyone had recognized. I sat in the corridor outside the intensive care unit with the wooden box on my lap and the particular stillness of a person who has run out of next steps to plan. I had no voting rights. I had no authority to direct the audit on my own timeline. The board was suspended in uncertainty. Travis was still available to any camera pointed his direction, and the one person who understood every layer of what was happening was unreachable behind a surgical door. Travis's attorney contacted Julian before the end of that day. The structure of the message was an offer. The function of it was a threat. If I signed a statement confirming the financial guarantee, as legitimate withdrew the audit request and transferred control of the Breakwater Point asset to Travis as part of the divorce resolution, he would retract the court motion and cease engaging with the press. If I declined, he would sustain the public campaign until the board determined that completing the transfer of Alderaan authority was no longer defensible, and I would lose the position before I had ever formally occupied it. He was betting that I was isolated enough and frightened enough to decide that something was better than nothing. I read my mother's letter again that night, sitting in a chair near my father's room. I had it close to memorized by then, but I needed to see the handwriting, the way she formed certain words, the weight she put on certain lines, the evidence that she had written it carefully and meant every word. She had written that the real failure was letting people who had hurt me keep deciding who I was. Travis was offering me an exit that preserved his version of events and erased his crime in the process. He had spent years telling me that my instincts were products of insecurity rather than observation. This offer was the same argument in legal form sign here to confirm that what you know to be false is true, and we'll call it settled. I told Julian to respond with one word, no. I was not going to validate a lie to give a man who had already taken everything reachable a clean way out. And I was going to find what I needed without my father's authority, without the board's ratification, without anything except what was already sitting in those files, waiting for someone to look at it, without flinching. Julian and I went back to the beginning and worked forward through everything Travis had submitted, not the summaries, not the narrative he had constructed around them, but the underlying data. Server logs, metadata. The technical record of when each file had been created, when it had last been touched, and from which machine. The emails Travis had presented to the board, as evidence of my prior knowledge of the guarantee, showed a sent timestamp of 11:43 on a Tuesday morning, 14 months prior. The server log for the account. Those emails had supposedly originated from showed zero activity during that entire window. The account itself was a duplicate same display name as a legitimate internal address, one character, different in the actual email string created 6 weeks before the fabricated correspondence was generated and never used for any other purpose. Someone had built a ghost account, written a fictional exchange, and submitted it to a legal proceeding as documentary evidence. That wasn't a man protecting himself in a divorce. That was a deliberate, premeditated crime. The audio recording required a different kind of analysis. Julian brought in a forensic specialist who worked through the waveform and located the edit, a splice positioned so close to the opening of the kept fragment that it had been engineered to sound like the natural beginning of a thought. The recording had originated from a phone call between me and Julian. In the original, I had said, "I don't want my father using the company to make Travis lose everything." Travis had removed the first 12 words. What remained, stripped of its context, sounded like intention. What existed in full was its precise opposite. The edit was technically clean, but forensically traceable, and the specialist could document exactly where the cut had been made and what had been removed. We had the fabricated emails. We had the spliced recording. The remaining piece was the guarantee itself, specifically the chain of custody that would connect the document to whoever had ordered it created. Julian's team pulled the access logs from the Barrett Coastal Ventures document management system, drilling into the folder where the nonprofit grant files had been archived. A file containing a high-resolution scan of my signature, extracted from a community land trust application I had signed during the second year of our marriage, had been downloaded from Kendra's workstation on a Wednesday afternoon, 11 days before the guarantee was dated. The download hadn't been attributed to any active project in the system. It had been routed directly to a personal external drive connected to her machine and hadn't been accessed again through the company's network. And the notary seal used to authenticate the forged document, the one I had noticed missing from our home office filing cabinet and never been able to locate, appeared in the margin notes of an earlier draft of the guarantee referenced by Travis in his internal shorthand as already secured. It hadn't been misplaced. It had been taken with a purpose months before the document was ever created. We had the mechanism. What we still needed was the direct line between Kendra's actions and Travis's instruction. Julian said that if Travis had been careful, those communications would have been kept verbal. We might be able to prove what had been done without being able to prove who had given the order, which would give Travis room to claim she had acted on her own initiative. Then Kendra called Julian directly on a Friday morning and asked to meet that afternoon. What she had found was a draft legal declaration saved to a shared cloud account that she and Travis had used throughout their relationship to exchange files and pass documents back and forth outside the company system. Travis had stopped using the account weeks earlier when the investigation began, but he had not revoked Kendra's login credentials, an oversight in the belief that she was still fully aligned with his version of events. The declaration was written as a sworn statement in which Travis described discovering only after the fact that a former employee had accessed confidential client files and used a client's signature without his knowledge or authorization. He had named Kendra specifically. He had described her as someone who had taken unilateral action driven by her own motivations, decisions he had known nothing about and would never have sanctioned. The document was undated and unfiled, held in reserve for the moment when the investigation closed in far enough to require a name attached to the forgery. Kendra brought Julian the text messages. She brought him the call logs. She brought him a copy of this guarantee as it had existed before. My signature was applied an earlier version that still contained Travis's internal formatting notes in the margins written in the shorthand he used when drafting documents for his own reference, with the nonprofit grant folder identified by name as the source and the notary seal referenced as ready to use. She had kept these materials because she had understood from the beginning that her position in the arrangement was not secure. She had not imagined the contingency plan would be a sworn statement naming her as the sole responsible party. In exchange for full cooperation with the investigation, she asked for whatever consideration the process was able to offer. Julian came back and set everything on the table. I read through the text messages without rushing. Travis's voice was completely recognizable in them, that same flat procedural precision he used when managing logistics, the same tone he had used to tell caterers where to position furniture and tell me to stay out of sight during his investor event. He had used that same voice to instruct someone to steal my signature, take a notary seal from my own home, and forge a $25 million debt in my name. What I felt reading those messages wasn't the satisfaction I might have expected. It was something quieter, the particular settling that happens when you have spent a long time being told your perceptions are wrong and the evidence finally confirms in documented and time-stamped detail that they were not. Julian asked me what I wanted to do about Kendra's cooperation request. I told him I wasn't offering her forgiveness, that wasn't mine to give, and it wasn't what she was asking for. But I wasn't going to interfere with the agreement. She had caused real harm. She had also handed us the last piece of the case, and I was going to let the legal process determine what her cooperation was worth in terms of her own consequences. The public hearing was scheduled 12 days after my father's surgery. He was recovering steadily, but hadn't been cleared to leave the hospital. I went without him. Travis arrived with his attorney and took his seat at the respondent's table in a suit selected with the kind of visible care that communicates effort to the person wearing it. Without realizing it, communicates the effort to everyone watching. When the panel gave him the floor, he said that a man had a fundamental right to know the full financial picture of the person he was building a life with, and that if I had genuinely loved him, I would have told him the truth about my family from the beginning. He said it with the measured conviction of someone who had practiced it enough times that it had stopped feeling like an argument and started feeling like a wound. When the panel recognized me, I said that I had kept my father's assets private because I wanted to know whether someone could choose me without them. I said that decision, whatever anyone thought of it, was not fraud, and it did not give Travis the right to do what the evidence showed he had done. I was not asking the panel to hold Travis accountable for ending the marriage, or for any feeling he had developed or lost along the way. I was asking them to hold him accountable for forging a financial document in my name, constructing a fictional email correspondence, editing a recorded phone call, and submitting all of it as evidence in a legal proceeding. Those were not things that had happened to him. Those were things he had planned, instructed, and executed. Julian presented the server analysis, the waveform documentation, the file access logs, the text messages, and the draft declaration Travis had prepared to redirect liability toward Kendra. Travis's attorney raised procedural objections at several points. The panel noted them and continued. Somewhere around the middle of the presentation, Travis stopped looking at the materials being displayed and fixed his gaze on a point on the table in front of him, with the expression of someone who has been running the same calculation repeatedly and keeps arriving at the same unwanted answer. The findings developed over the 3 weeks that followed. The financial guarantee bearing my name was formally determined to be fraudulent, and my liability for the $25 million was discharged entirely. The court motion Travis had filed to restrict my access to marital assets was dismissed. The Alderon Trust structures had been established nearly a decade before our marriage and existed entirely outside any marital property framework. Travis was referred for criminal investigation on charges that included financial fraud document, forgery, unauthorized use of a notarial seal, and submission of fabricated evidence to a legal proceeding. Barrett Coastal Ventures lost its operating license and filed for bankruptcy protection within the month. The network. Travis had built his identity around the rooms he had spent years positioning himself to belong to, withdrew their association with a speed that made clear those connections had always been contingent on his appearing to be something he wasn't. Pamela, whose social standing had been inseparable from her son's projected success, found that the Barrett name she had wielded as a measuring stick for other people's worth was now attached to the bankruptcy filing and a criminal referral. She sent a message through a mutual contact suggesting that people who had once been family ought to find a way toward forgiveness. I understood what she was asking for, and I understood that she was not sorry for what she had done to me. She was sorry that it had produced this outcome rather than a different one. I asked the contact to tell her not to reach out again. Kendra faced her own legal exposure related to the forgery and the misuse of the notarial seal. The cooperation she had provided reduced the severity of what she ultimately faced, but it didn't undo what she had chosen to do. My father came home on a Thursday, 26 days after the surgery. He moved with more care than before, but his voice was the same, and his thinking was entirely intact. And those were the things I had been most afraid of losing. We sat in the kitchen at Redfern Estate, and he told me he had wanted to stand up in that board meeting and end the whole thing, had wanted to say who he was and watch the room realign and protect me from what was coming. He said he had stopped himself because he knew Travis well enough by then to know what would happen next. An immediate recalculation, a performed apology, just enough manufactured uncertainty to keep me tethered to something I deserved to be free of. Letting me leave Breakwater House that night had been the only way to make sure Travis couldn't reverse course and talk his way back in. He said he had trusted me to find my way to what needed to happen. I told him I hadn't known the way, not at first. He said that was all right. He said arriving eventually was enough. The board restored my voting rights in full and completed the formal transfer of executive authority without further delay. Gerald, who had questioned whether the transition was wise on the first morning, I sat at that conference table, shook my hand after the ratification was signed, and said nothing, which I took as the most honest response available to him. I became executive chair of Alderon Global Consortium on a Tuesday morning by signing a document Julian had prepared with his characteristic precision. The first significant decision I made in that role was about Breakwater Point. Alderon held the primary secured position on the asset after Barrett Coastal Ventures entered bankruptcy, and the property came under our control through the standard recovery process. The original development plan, the luxury resort Travis had borrowed against misrepresented, to build and forged documents to protect, I canceled. The portions of the land that cleared the environmental review Travis had bypassed were redirected toward a mixed-use community development, affordable housing units, a vocational training center, and a legal aid office serving women working to leave financially controlling relationships. The coastal wetlands Travis had tried to build over were left alone. Breakwater House itself, the property where my suitcase had been set on the front steps where a wedding ring had been dropped into an open bag, and I had been told to take my father and go, became a permanent community resource center. We named it the Miriam Ellsworth Family Resource Center after my mother, who had written in a letter she prepared for a moment she knew might come that leaving a place that doesn't respect you is not the same as losing it. Almost a year after the night I had driven away in my father's truck, my father and I stood together at the base of those same front steps. The gravel looked the same. The light off the water looked the same. The sign that had read "Private Investor Residence" was gone, replaced by something plain and readable from the road. The doors were open, and a group of women was making their way up the path for the first intake session of the legal aid program, some with children, some carrying bags, all of them moving with the careful deliberateness of people who aren't yet certain they are allowed to take up space in a room built for them. My father asked if I remembered the question he had asked me the night we left. I told him I did. He asked whether I had an answer now that felt complete. I thought about everything that had happened in the distance between that Thursday and this one. The file on the conference table, my mother's letter. The hallway outside the ICU, the hearing room. The morning I had walked into an office in Portland and decided to stop waiting for someone else to confirm I belonged there. I told him I hadn't gone back inside. I had just made it into something worth walking into. The first session was beginning. None of those women knew anything about Alderon or about what had happened on these steps a year ago. They knew only that someone had built a place where a door would be open when another one had been closed on them. That felt in the end like the more important thing to have built. Travis had thrown my suitcase down those steps because he believed I was someone who could be discarded without consequence. He had been wrong about that from the first day he met me, not because of the money, not because of the name, not because of anything he could have discovered about my father. He had been wrong because of what he had chosen not to see when he looked at me. The money only made his mistake visible. The person he had underestimated had always been there. And that's where Marin's story ends, not with a courtroom victory held up like a trophy, but with a door held open for someone who needed it. I think the reason stories like this stay with people is that most of us have been in a room where someone decided our value for us and believed them at least for a while. The real journey isn't the reveal. It's the moment you stop letting someone else's inability to see you function as evidence that you aren't there. If that's something you want to keep thinking about, subscribe and come back. We tell stories about people who are underestimated and what happens when they finally stop explaining themselves. There's always another one waiting. Thank you for listening.